there's not a moment really in our day where we are not interacting with textiles. And you can fast from food for a day, but the notion of fasting from textile use for a day is much more challenging. The cost of what the average household was spending on their clothing in the 60s would be here. And the cost of what we're spending as a household now on our textiles has dropped or stayed the same. People are still making our clothing, but we are paying far, far less than we were 4 decades ago. And when everything else is escalated in value, you can't know that and not acknowledge how much we are devaluing the farmers who are growing the materials, the hand workers that are in factories that are weaving the cloth, sewing the cloth. And, our textiles are an agricultural statement. We are either siding with oil and gas when we purchase synthetic materials. That is a vote in favor of the oil and gas industry. Or we are siding with natural materials and are recognizing that we can't all wear clothing in the way we are now shopping and consuming that is connected to the land.
Welcome to another episode of We Are Carbon. I'm Helen Fisher, and you've just heard from Sharon Kallis, who is joining us to share some incredible insights about textiles. This is a fascinating conversation filled with very thought-provoking concepts, such as that idea right there at the start, that it's easier for us to spend a day without food than a day without textiles. There's so much packed into Sharon's thinking, as she has pretty much unpicked the place of textiles in our lives through her personal exploration and challenge of growing her own clothes. I, for one, am hugely inspired by her work, which also includes community projects that layer up the opportunities to reconnect with people, plants, and place, which all feels like it's as much about rediscovering a slower, more purposeful pace of life as it is about producing food, fibre, and crafts. To learn more from Sharon and to keep exploring our journey here at We Are Carbon, be sure to check the links in the description. And now let's get into the conversation. I hope you enjoy.
Thank you, Helen. It's really lovely to be here. Honored to be amongst the other guests that you've featured on We Are Carbon. My name is Sharon Kallis, and I am on the west coast of Canada. I live in a place known as Vancouver, British Columbia, on the unceded and stolen territories of the Homaquiyam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. That's very much a part of my work and what it means to be living in this time and place as somebody who is settler descendant. I grew up in Ontario, far from here, a few thousand kilometers. And so I moved to the coast when I was in my early 20s. And the landscape here is so very different. Arriving on the edge of the Pacific, the plants are different. I was immediately awestruck and wanting to figure out how to connect to place and how I could kind of build a home for myself here and connect to this land in some way, and recognizing that I am probably 7 generations of people in my family that have been born in one place and picked up and moved to another place. And so I am carrying on that story. My ancestors came from parts of Wales and Scotland and England and Germany and Ireland, and unpacking some of their own reasons for leaving and the migration stories is a part of kind of how I think about arriving here and looking to the land and the plants, many of which belong here and many are like myself and my family. They've come from other places for various reasons, and how that all kind of fits together. So the long title I give myself is an environmental community engaged artist. My background and training is in the arts. with a particular focus, mostly self-directed in textile design or textiles. And I essentially grow my own clothing is one way of looking at it. And I bring other people on that journey with me in terms of unpacking what the skills are that are required. Where are those fibers coming from? What are the traditional techniques and cultural practices linked with all of those plants and animals that we are reliant on for clothing ourselves?
Thank you so much. It's so beautiful to listen to that. That idea that you've given such thought to the origins and the culture and the place throughout your ancestry. That is something that I think is heavily overlooked today. And this very disconnected feeling of where we come from and how dependent we are upon the life of the plant world and the animals around us, very easy to overlook. And I think that's fabulous sort of a way to open this up, because as an artist and somebody coming at this from this place of textiles, I'm really, really excited and delighted to have you here to share your story. I'm so inspired by your work. On a very personal kind of point of view, I think what you do is fantastic. And then on this place of bringing this through the lens of We Are Carbon and looking at how the stuff we use in our lives and where things come from, how that has this connection to the world around us, and how perhaps that can be tied in to some of the horror stories we hear about climate change or and such. So yeah, very, very excited to dive in from this topic of textiles in a really connected way to ourselves and to the landscape. I think, yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. I think that there's so much that interests me about your story. To unpick this, it would be fantastic to maybe learn about the work you're doing at this time, which is taking that artistry into community and into gardens. Perhaps you could share a bit about the work that you're doing in that zone.
Sure. So I founded a nonprofit arts organization just over a decade ago called EartHand Gleaners Society. And gleaners as a word, if people are not familiar, gleaners is basically an old agricultural term for the individuals that would come in after a crop has perhaps been harvested and would be picking up what was left in the field. And so it's often that gathering what's unwanted, gathering what has been not seen as worthy for use. Often that is a term that would be thought of as somebody that was, or people that were marginalized community members, people who were not in the kind of economic movers and shakers, if you will, at the forefront, were not the ones that were gleaning. And myself as an artist who has been low income, living in a low income, very urban community for decades, gleaning is something that really resonates for me as a contemporary term, and also comes from my kind of origins of my art practice going back about 2.5 decades now of working with parkboard green waste. So looking at what were the plants that were kind of end of season that we could be gathering from that kind of urban industry of park tending and reclaiming plants for natural dyes, for weaving projects, the notion that enough of anything can be made into something, and discovering what that something is becomes the kind of, the exciting act of inquiry and discovery. And so EartHand Gleaners Society manages for Vancouver Park Board 2 environmental learning gardens. So we have two gardens, very different in scope. They're just a couple of miles from each other, or kilometers from each other, I should say, but they are quite radically different in the environment, the soil. One is a steep hillside. It's much more mature. The other is on what had been a intertidal marsh that was filled with debris or infill when the trains were coming through, and all the infill was dumped into this marsh zone. So there is no real soil in that area. It's very dry. There's maybe about 4, 5, 6 inches of soil that's been added, and it's a very hot lots of concrete around, very, very different environment. Anyway, I digress. We've got these 2 gardens that we can be growing artist materials from, and just creating that opportunity to think about our material resource and as makers, where are our materials coming from? So EarthHand's basic mandate is asking the guiding question, how do we be makers without first being consumers? And so starting from that point, if you wanted to knit a pair of socks for somebody as a gift, where is the yarn coming from? Have you spun the yarn? Have you processed the fiber? Is it a local fleece? What's your relationship with the farmer? Did you buy the needles? Can you carve those needles? What's the best wood for making those needles? What's the color that you are using? What's your relationship to those plants that are providing that color? Are those plants that culturally are relevant to you? Are they culturally relevant to your next door neighbor? What is the story that we can unpack on the migration of those plants and the moving of those plants from one place to another? So, one great question leads to another dozen great questions. And that's kind of the way EarthHand has evolved, is just stepping into asking good questions and then finding people that we can be in partnership with for discovering the answers. And, there's usually never one answer. There's a multitude of answers. And so really leaning into that complexity and recognizing often in a project, we just end up with more questions than we do answers. But in that process, there are lots of skills that are being discovered. There are lots of relationships that are being formed between different individuals that perhaps would never have a reason to otherwise come together. And the notion of a fiber shed is a very common principle now that Rebecca Burgess and the folks with Fiber Shed out of California have really done a great job of taking into an international consciousness. But that notion of where is your clothing coming from? What is similar to a watershed? What is your 150 mile or 100 kilometer range that you're looking to for sourcing your relationship to where the fibers are coming from, who's processing, who's designing, who's making, and who's consuming, and bringing farmers and designers and everyone in between into some relationship with each other. And so where a city context really comes into play as a part of that, I think, is recognizing we also need to develop our skill shed. Who are the people that we are in relationship with, where we're not able to do something on our own? If we might be fantastic at spinning, but weaving isn't going to be our thing, or building the tools required for processing fibers. Who are the people that we can know and build a relationship of trust and collaboration, and continue to kind of grow out what that community is that leads to some community resilience as a big part of the work. And how are we changing our relationship to place so that we are not approaching either the land, the animals, the plants, each other from a consumer commodification perspective, but from a place of being in relation with each other and recognizing our interdependence. So those are, I guess, some of the big things that we look to in doing very humble acts, such as planting plants and spreading wood chips and creating pathways through urban access gardens, and learning about seasonal relationships of land tending, and looking at city parks with a different perspective where they're working landscapes. It's not just beautiful backdrops that somebody else is tending for, background in your family photos or for your Instagram reel. There's actually the plantings that are there. It often is very beautiful, but the plants are also themselves full of stories that they can tell of what their traditional uses are. And we're doing our best to honor those opportunities and learn about how we can be connecting back to working with the plants that we find in our world.
Yeah, so beautiful. It resonates enormously with me. And I think that anyone listening who hasn't sort of stepped into the world of seeing plants as that resource for crafts and artistry, the idea of going on a journey of how do I knit a pair of socks from local materials, it's quite overwhelming to think, and I can very much understand why the projects always are bringing up more questions than they expected to at the outset. And I think that is the beauty of what you're doing there, is actually that rediscovery of the abundance of possibilities right there in our landscape that have been significantly overlooked. And there's two sides to this. There's the side of the practical and what the landscape can provide to us, but there's also this very clear sense of connectivity and valuing people. And bringing up that word interconnected, I think it's so significant for people to really sit with that, because this interconnectedness that we have is there whether we choose to observe it or not. But so much of the time we're interconnected with people and situations, factories that are occurring the other side of the world, and we're not taking any note that we wouldn't have these wonderful things that we use every day that we depend on without this whole world of connectivity around us. And why not make that conscious and recognize that there's a person at the other end of this? And when we start to value that, perhaps there's something quite important that happens from that. So I think that there's, the work that you're doing here it's kind of one of those things where it's so much more than the sum of its parts. And I would love to maybe learn an example or two about the people side of it. Have you kind of felt that the experience of the project has brought through any kind of observations of what crafts can mean to people and their well-being and that connectivity of community?
Yes. It's interesting. So the gardening part of like the tending the plants, I often find there are some individuals that come out and they just love being in the gardens with us, and that they're really committed to the garden, hands in soil, learning about the trees, learning about the plants, learning about the relationships between the different plants and trees, and where those systems of connectivity happen. But they have very little interest in what happens after we're seasonally harvesting a particular, they might be kind of curious, but they're not going to come to those workshops. And then there are folks who are really interested in the making and not so much the gardening, or, there's physical limitations and realities that limit somebody's participation in the physical work. I always kind of think of how we can engage our hands, our heads, and our hearts, and where in any project there are different ways of entering, and we each have kind of a way that we're going to be perhaps drawn into something. It might be because of the handwork that we're drawn in and that tactile experience. It might be more from the heart, where we're really drawn into the social community part of what's happening, and our need to connect with others that are like-minded, that will kind of get us out of our own homes and into that particular working circle. And then there are those that are intellectually are really just fascinated at the notion of how a plant can become a textile, or how invasive species can be up-purposed in different ways into basketry or a variety of things. And so often people will show up because they're drawn from one perspective that is their usual route of entry of how they move through the world. And then they'll be surprised and they'll recognize that, oh, actually, I wasn't interested in that at all, but that's actually what's going to keep me coming back. So there's that component of different levels of participation and different ways that people step into the work. We work with, often there's lots of students coming from university or college that are doing land-based programs, whether it's urban agriculture or horticulture or landscape architecture, people who are in art school, in crafting programs. in doing fine art programs, individuals who are local neighbors and residents that are looking for ways to connect to the land and ways to kind of step into place. Again, because we're so urban, having access to land here really is a privilege. And I think it's a privilege anywhere, actually. And so for a lot of people, there's a mental health component, absolutely. And also that notion of this was the biggie for me coming out of art school and knowing I did not want to be a commercial artist. And I also didn't have money to be then buying art materials where I wasn't planning on selling something at the end of the journey. So what is there in the world that is without a monetary cost up front demand? Where is there something that, I don't like to use the word free because there are other costs of time and labor and the cost of relationship to place that needs to be built. And, so free is a challenging word to use, but being able to remove the barrier of not having the cash to pay for supplies. And so how can you look to maybe things that are growing bountifully right around you that are sustainably harvestable and that you can be learning about that plant and stepping into relationship with that plant. One of the biggest challenges I have continually, it happens for me as an individual still, even after all these years, and I see it for others who are especially eager, keen, new folks just learning to connect to the land for finding material access for creative projects, is trying to break down the consumer model that we have all been so ingrained with of just taking, and that if something is there, we can just help ourselves to it. And that kind of consumptive attitude that we have all for several generations now grown up with. And we have lost the relationship to place and the means of collectively co-sharing. How do we take care of the commons areas? What does that mean to be acknowledging others, to be acknowledging the beyond human that are also reliant on a place? And so even the kind of operating systems and principles for having a group of people that are all wanting to maybe harvest nettle at the start of the year for tea, when people now this time of year are very excited about nettle for tea. But what does that mean for the plants? What does that mean for the pollinators? And how does that impact where you're harvesting for those that would want to be gathering for the fiber from those stalks? Because when you pinch off a leader on a plant in the spring, it bifurcates. And so now you've got a stalk that's going to be really subpar for gathering a really long line. The fiber comes from the stalk of the plant, the same way as flax or hemp. It's called a bast fiber. And so when you are harvesting for tea and nipping off the top of the plant, it's going to grow like this, and you've got something that's much more inferior for fiber. But how do you communicate that to people in a city that are just suddenly feeling excited to be harvesting their own tea and might be coming back every day to the same spot as if they're walking into a grocery store and just picking something off the shelf and not aware of any of that? So there's lots of complexity and challenge around how we learn to kind of modify our own behavior and how we share good systems with those around us. It's an added complexity here in that we are on traditional territories that are unceded, but even in places where there are treaties, what does that mean to be guests in a place and to be in this time where we are aware of some of the many horrors that happened in the colonization project, and in stepping into doing work that is reconciliatory? What does that look like in our actual day-to-day actions of being in relationship to place and still feeling like we can move through the world in a good way and be in connection with the land in a good way, but how are we acknowledging the contemporary descendants of those who were pushed off the land a few generations ago? So, there's all of those pieces that get tied into something that otherwise can appear very simple on the surface of, I grow my own clothes. And then these are the questions that we unpack. So anyway, I do work as much as possible with several skill holders from different nations that are here. This place of Vancouver has 3 different nations whose this is shared territory. And so I have many friends that I'm very grateful for their patience with me as I learn to kind of acknowledge the privilege that I grew up with and some of my own inherent learning that needs to be changing and shifting, and do my best to be as respectful as I can and pass on what I am learning to others so that we can all be kind of going forward as human beings with the best of intentions and with kind of openness and kindness and with good hearts and help each other in our learning as we're going forward.
How wonderful. It really is a conversation that helps us to get to grips with this idea of complexity as something that is ever evolving and ever there for us to, we need to have that complexity in our world. And our lives. We need to acknowledge the place of that and not oversimplify things into segmented wholes and say, well, this is what we do with this and this is how we do that. And just that clear example with the nettles, something that for most people it would be difficult to excite them about nettles, to give them the idea that, okay, this is not just overtaking all the wild land, this is a valuable resource. And then that kind of complexity, that new layer you added to that, okay, well, now we achieved that. They're too excited. They're going in there and they're ravenous and they're so taking up all the plants and they're not giving a thought to the other layers of that picture. And so it is constantly evolving. And what a beautiful way to look at these very abundant plants as a way that we can learn together how to coexist together with one another's needs, whether that's, are we going to harvest tea or are we going to harvest fibre? And then how do we coexist with the other insects and the non-human entities? Because well, we just wouldn't have anything without them. And I find it so fascinating that this is something that comes and is birthed out of giving access to a piece of land and knowledge, connection, sharing that passion that you have and that interest in making that available. And what beautiful things. Anybody can be inspired by this and think, how could we create a learning environment in our city or our town? And how wonderful that is. Would you consider the land and the sites that you manage, are they a commons area that people can come and connect and become involved in their own, just as and when it suits them? Or is it much more organized and
somewhere in the middle, I think would be the short answer. And it really, there's challenges. For one, we're highly reliant on volunteerism, and just recognizing the challenge of most people having the capacity to pay their rent and buy their groceries every month. With various jobs and time demands and family, et cetera. And so where people even have the time to volunteer, I've seen a real change in the last even decade in terms of who has the capacity to come out. And so where do we find the ways to support that? And the role that I am in, my partner, David Goman, is my kind of co-lead in the gardens. And, we are in cooperative artist housing. So our housing is very affordable. It allows us to not have to make top dollar for every hour that we're working. And so we have no children. We're child free. So we're in this real place of privilege of being able to dedicate time where we want to dedicate time. And there are so few people that are in the same position as ourselves to be able to be in those kind of leadership roles that are so volunteer based. And so how do we create systems on a larger level, whether it's basic living allowance, which I think of our housing affordability is kind of on par with the basic living allowance in many ways. How do we have government systems that support communities, members being able to volunteer in their own communities for these types of things to kind of be able to grow and go forward? Right now, we're doing a lot of research into what co-op models could look like for how we could have a garden co-op land care collaborative model. What could that look like? And then also, what are the various systems that have been broken and fractured through the cutting off of the commons, the pushing people off the land that was happening in Europe, the colonization project here that pushed people off their land and broke those hereditary land relationships. So we don't have systems that we can easily be looking to that are kind of clear for how we collectively hold and manage. It's a part of what's been lost. In the same way that we're losing the hand skills, we're also losing those social systems and trying to figure out what is a contemporary model of that acknowledges the traditions of the place one finds themselves, as well as the contemporary reality of who are the people that are in a place and what are their own capacities. So how do we kind of like reshape something is a bigger question that is kind of an ongoing. And I think for me, it's a part of even thinking about my succession planning on if I was taken out of the picture tomorrow, how would things go on in the gardens in terms of who would be developing the workshops and the programs that we offer for accessing the plants, and who would be coordinating the willow harvest or it's time to do this task now, and all of those pieces so we still do need to have some core individuals that are kind of at the center point. And the way that we work now, basically we have essentially from mid-spring, so we've just started last week, to Thanksgiving in mid-October. We have once a week work party in each of the gardens. And so, Tuesday nights at one and Wednesday nights at another. And it's just an open opportunity for community members to come out and be in the gardens and help with the daily tasks and whatever's happening seasonally. And there's always like lovely little learning opportunities that come up of like, oh, look at this plant that's at this point now, and hey, we can make rope with this. And so those little moments of discovery that come out of those sessions. And then, through our website, we have people that will come find out about our events and come and join us for some of the seasonal celebration and community parties that we have. We're going to do some flax breaking for linen and stripping willow bark off branches that are being harvested for bark at the end of this month. And then we have longer durational programs that are learning cohorts that people will pay for on a sliding scale based on what they're able to pay. And as much as possible, we really work to kind of reconnect so that people aren't just coming out and taking a class where they're using the plants that have come from the garden, but as a part of those workshops, they are spending time in the gardens, helping us on some of the tasks so that there is that invitation to step into relationship with the seasons, the plants, the land, as well as with each other. And then those relationships start to build to make that connection for folks of what it is they're handling and where it's come from. And that seasonal awareness, as much as anything, is reestablished for when we're planting, when we're harvesting, how we're tending, and how we're supporting all of those plants.
Fantastic. Could I ask a little about the plants themselves? And if I'm sure that this is an extensive experience and catalogue of what can be used and what they can be used for. But if we focused on fibre and what can
Yes.
be turned into
Yes.
textiles,
Yes.
could you share a little of some of the examples and the experiments of the different types of plants and what would be considered weeds that you've been able to utilize for fibre?
Okay. Well, I think so. Growing flax for linen is a really, and shall I say, a simple one, an easy. It's a 100-day annual crop that can be harvested. The ones that am more excited about are plants that are not necessarily considered usual in city parks, especially. So stinging nettle, actually intentionally planting stinging nettle in City Park is kind of fantastic and a little subversive, perhaps. Other plants that I take great pleasure in as kind of a part of my own steps in reconciliation and supporting the nations whose land I'm on are bringing in and bringing back some of the plants that Park Board has not wanted to see growing in city parks. So nettle was on that list, but also fireweed or rose herb willow, I think is the other common name. I'm not going to come up with the Latin off the top of my head. But fireweed, milkweed, and dogbane are all species that belong across this continent and were often taken out because they were toxic to cattle. They didn't suit the human agenda, but they also are plants that have really strong traditional uses in hand technologies for multitude of nations across this continent, but also throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And so where we can look at a plant like fireweed or a plant like nettle, and for me, it's a culture connector to my ancestors, but then I can be working with my friend from the Katzie Nation or a friend from the Squamish Nation, and they also have this ancestral lineage. And so those plants become a shared point of learning for us. Milkweed as well. There's a David Suzuki Foundation is a very big thing in Canada, and David Suzuki, as an environmentalist, has been pushing for years about replanting the milkweed because the monarch butterfly is reliant on milkweed. Milkweed is also a fiber plant, and so there's lots of places where there's plants we have no idea we can be connecting with, and then even looking to flax for linen and recognizing the challenge in what seeds are accessible for growing the best linen. And now seeds are patented. So being able to actually even access seed that you can be growing up and growing seed for resale is no longer an easy or simple thing. And so learning there's more to natural fibers to wear than cotton or linen. And a lot of people don't even recognize now that linen comes from flax seeds. So if you think of the flax seed that's maybe in your breakfast muffin, that flax seed can grow up to be either oil and, flax oil, but also that the fiber itself is in the stalk and is this beautiful, long, strong, vibrant plant for incredible cloth. And what has happened around the world is, in the name of efficiency, most linen processing mills for processing a very long fiber have been closed down. And now linen is cottonized, meaning that it is cooked in like a soda ash, something very high pH, and cut into a short fiber so that it can be processed in a cotton mill and spun in a cotton mill. And so the mills can shift from cotton to linen with some certain amount of ease. But what that means is that a linen shirt or linen bedding that in our grandparents' time would have lasted their lifetime and been what actually would be in a woman's will as her movables that you would inherit, somebody's linens, those beautiful, strong fibers that will last for decades as woven goods are now going to last for a couple of years. And that's it, because we've taken something inherently long and strong and we've made it really short and then spun it where that fiber is not going to last as long with twist as something long, the physics of that. And that is just another piece in the crazy puzzle of what is our current textile reality. So even those simple moments where we can have community events where we're putting flax straw out that's been retted, controlled rot that helps break down the pectins and the lignins that are binding the fiber to the plant stalk. So when that retting happens, you can release the fibers, and just doing community events where you have the equipment out for people to kind of physically bang on this straw and take it through to something that feels like hair is a phenomenal experience for many people. I'm shocked at how common it is when I'm talking to a group of people, adults and children, and all first question is like, are you wearing a knit or are you wearing a woven? Like, what is the structure of the cloth you're wearing? And people, they don't know. They'll look at their t-shirts and they'll say with their t-shirts, well, this is woven, right? Like we don't even see the textiles that are around us now. They're everywhere. Textiles are like the air that we breathe. We don't think about it because we wake up with our head on a pillow. We pick up a towel when we get out of the shower. We put our feet down on a bath mat. We pick up a towel to wash our dishes and dry our dishes. There's not a moment really in our day where we are not interacting with textiles. And you can fast from food for a day, but the notion of fasting from textile use for a day is much more challenging. And we have degraded the process of making our textiles to the point now where we're just not even aware of the value of where that cloth has come from, who the humans are that have been involved in all of the various steps. There's a book that came out a couple of years ago. Sophie Thanhauser is the author, called Worn: A People's History of Clothing. And it's a really fantastic book for somebody who is brand new to thinking about clothing in relationship to land, textiles in relationship to land. There's a moment in it in the cotton chapter, and I think it's a farmer in Texas talking about cotton who makes the comment that the cost of a car or a truck in the 1960s and what that cost was then in the 60s and the cost of that truck now in 2022, let's say when the book was written, has gone from here to here. And then we look at the cost of textiles and the cost of what the average household was spending on their clothing in the 60s would be here. And the cost of what we're spending as a household now on our textiles has dropped or stayed the same for more articles that we're acquiring. You know, the price per garment is dropping down and we're buying far, far more. And that in and of itself is kind of horrifying. And then you think about the fact that the auto industry is completely mechanized and robots are the ones that are actually doing the making. And there are far fewer humans in those factories working with those machines to make a truck or a car. But textiles are still made by hand. We have not yet figured out, thankfully, how to put robots with enough finesse in this incredible tool to push textiles through a sewing machine. And so people are still making our clothing, but we are paying far, far less than we were 4 decades ago. And when everything else is escalated in value, it recognizes you can't know that and not acknowledge how much we are devaluing the farmers who are growing the materials, the hand workers that are in factories that are weaving the cloth, sewing the cloth. And, you know, our textiles are an agricultural statement. We are either siding with oil and gas when we purchase synthetic materials. That is a vote in favor of the oil and gas industry. Or we are siding with natural materials and are recognizing that we can't all wear clothing in the way we are now shopping and consuming that is connected to the land. So we need to consume less. We need to take better care of the clothes that we're wearing. And, you know, I always think about how do we shop at the top of our pay grade? How do we buy things that are the best quality that we can afford? So that's not necessarily a name brand, but secondhand clothes that are good quality that we can keep wearing and mending and remaking. And how does that allow us to honor the textiles as well as those original farmers and plants and soil and laborers that were connected to those garments that keep us warm and keep us comfortable and safe and covered.
That was amazing. It's absolutely wonderful to hear you put it so clearly. Some of these statements that you've said that you've put your mind onto topics that people take for granted and don't give any thought to, and just given people pause to say, actually, yeah, absolutely. You know, we can't go a day without textiles.
Yeah.
And yet we don't value it enough to even acknowledge that, you know, we expect it to be throwaway. We expect it to be cheap. Yeah. And it is, I always think of it in the terms of anything that's well made from good materials by a craftsperson, especially if they're local to us. The price of that is going to be more than buying something that has had also to be transported across the globe, gone through lots of middlemen. And we buy that multiple times and it's still cheaper than that one purchase that would last a lifetime. And why is that? Who's being undervalued? And where is that cost actually going? And I think that you summed that up so beautifully with those examples there. And I'd never thought of the kind of idea that it's easier to go with food than it is to go without textiles. That, very mind-opening.
Yeah.
And I enjoy how you brought in the farming side of it too, because that's something we weave in a lot onto the podcast, the way that the soil is treated, the way that the farmers can have the ability to earn their living and the value that's placed there and the complexities with seed sovereignty and the direction of that. And you brought all of that into the context of textiles. And that's really what I kind of want to open up to people, is that everything really comes back to soil and how we go about our lives. We are voting for fossil fuels or for soil. And then, of course, within the soil quandary, we have a choice again. Are we looking at that as a way that's helping soil? Are we depleting soil? And of course, as we add these layers of complexity, it makes life somewhat more difficult, or we have to be more discerning and we have to look into things. But it is very, very eye-opening, and it helps us to recognize what the path forward might look like. As we take all of that and that very grand scale of agriculture and mass production, as you've kind of touched upon, the factories and the technologies that have really caused limitations on how the fibres are utilised and the strength of it, all of that is kind of in this one side of where the modern world has taken us, and it is depleting quality and depleting the way that we value people and place. And then at the absolute other end of that scale is yourself saying, I'm going to grow my own clothes. And I'd love if we could learn about that journey, because it sounds like the title for a movie. It sounds like something that should be, we should definitely be learning about here. So what ignited it?
Well, I grew up surrounded by, a textile awareness, shall we say. My grandmother was an incredible knitter. My mom was a fantastic seamstress. My dad even, for a few years there was a rug hooker when I was young. So there was kind of crafting around me, and I was very put off at a young age by, when I was like 12, the notion of the name branding that I was seeing was really, that kind of grade 7. And I don't know if it was just that I was suddenly aware of it when I was like 12, or if that also had to do with the era I grew up in the 80s, where those name brands and kind of like name brand shirts became a thing. And I just thought that was kind of wretched and horrible. And at that point started kind of cutting apart clothes that were no longer being worn in our house, and made a mess of many really good quality garments in my kind of erratic learning journey. But I've recognized the incredible joy of back sourcing, taking care of myself. And I think a lot about where there is moments for curated efficiency, and otherwise where can I be almost as inefficient as possible, because I don't need to be hyper efficient. And I think our industrialization has been so driven by textiles. And when you start to unpack the history of the Industrial Revolution and connect that with all the disruptive technologies that were coming in to play as the textile industry was kind of rushing to catch up with itself, from suddenly new spinning inventions to new weaving inventions, and the dyeing processes and aniline dyes or chemical dyes, and all of that sort of shifting and pushing and making everybody that was working around work faster. And so what does it mean to actually go slower and to do things in a gentle and slow way? So over the last 5 years, I guess, I think it was when I turned 50, I decided I was done with jeans. I my jeans were all beyond needing repair. I needed to go and buy new pairs, and fitting jeans always feels horrible. And I thought, well, what does it look like if I take a pair of jeans, a pair of pants that were cotton that I love, and have a friend with better pattern drafting skills than me draft from those pants for me? Could I just use that as my pant pattern for everything? And so she drafted that first pattern. And then I went about initially buying some wool and buying some linen and making those pants on a sewing machine with wools and linens, and adapting the pattern and recognizing how I could shift the same pattern from one style to another, one fabric to another. And that then led to me looking, I think, at the pandemic. About a year later, the pandemic started, and there was this big, everybody suddenly shut in and locked down. And that kind of happened right in the time of April is like fashion month. And so like, where are we looking to our own homes for how we can be clothing ourselves? And so I started this little self-project called the Wardrobe Hack, where I was just looking at how I could use the clothing in my own closet that I no longer was wearing for whatever reason. Could I take it apart and use that textile in another way? Were there patterns from shirts particularly that I loved that were no longer serviceable? Could I pattern draft from those? And so I just started creating my garments from my garments, or from growing my own fibers. And my relationship with our shepherd on Barnston Island, it's about 40 kilometers from where I live in the city. So I just thought, well, what does it look like if I just don't buy any more clothes? And at that point, I'd mostly been a thrift store shopper. So, what will my underwear look like? What will my undershirts or bras look like? How will my wardrobe change? And so, I'm 5 years into that project now. I think the hardest piece was getting underwear that felt comfortable, that I could be in. Like, I go to a gym, and so that's kind of like the most strange place to be who I am in clothing that I've made myself in, with a bunch of other women in my bra and underwear. So I had, some awkward years there where I just felt like I was in, kind of cloth diapers, and I've happily progressed past that now. So yeah, for me, that's kind of the height of invisible labor, is the amount of time I put into the stitching of the clothes that people don't see. But I also recognized initially I was on my sewing machine. A friend gave me a treadle machine, and I loved the transition from a sewing machine to a treadle, and how quiet it was, and the fact I could work listening to an audiobook or music without the machine, and my sewing improved because suddenly I was moving slower, and I was solely on the treadle for about 8 months, maybe as long as a year, before I even gave up on using the treadle. And now everything is hand stitched, and recognizing how the hand stitching is this beautiful, gentle act while I'm listening to podcasts. I'm stitching while I maybe am watching TV at night. There's always hand stitching that I can be doing. And that's, pretty much all of my garments now are hand stitched. The old linen sheets are fantastic for making underwear and bras. There's the elastic around the sheets that becomes the elastic for underwear. I'm talking a lot about my underwear. Anyway. And then I have maybe 2 garments that I can make in a year, maybe a garment and a half, because, we're talking slow clothing. So there's a process, but maybe it takes a year of processing the wool and dyeing the wool and spinning the wool and weaving, and then the pattern drafting and the stitching of the final garment. And the design that I've realized is best is if I am doing each step along the way, making decisions for the next step. So instead of being like, here's the pattern, here's my yardage, I'm cutting out to make this object, I will spin the wool I have, I'll spin the flax I have, I'll dye it with the colors that are available. And I have kind of a vague notion of where it's going, but each step is really informing the decisions for the next step. So I end up being zero waste in the garment that's being made, because I'm realizing, well, I can weave this size of a piece. What is the garment in my wardrobe that I'm needing to replace that this could be made with in terms of the yardage? And so that making things almost as inefficient as possible for myself, with then those moments of where I'm curating efficiency. Like I use a spinning wheel instead of a drop spindle because I enjoy my spinning wheel, but I still travel with a drop spindle. There's other places where I might choose moments of efficiency, but I think at the end of the day, the joy that I have in all of those garments, even the textiles that I'm patching and stitching and repairing, there's this mental health connection to how I am moving through a day on the most mundane of chores. Like laundry day is glorious because I'm visiting with old friends. It's these garments that are taking care of me, and I am taking care of them. And washing day means I'm visiting with friends. It's, I'm having moments of like looking at the seams. It's like, oh, you need a little repair there. And how's that button wearing? And it's a very different experience than being in a kind of a null void sense of just like, oh, I've got to do laundry and blah. It would be kind of akin to eating a burger from a fast food restaurant, and how you just kind of like stuff that in your face because you're feeling hungry and it's in the moment you need to eat something, but you're not really enjoying that burger that you're stuffing in your face. It's a very different act if you've grown the tomato and you started the seed in the spring and you took care of that plant and watered that plant, and then you're harvesting that tomato and you've maybe made a tomato sauce, and now it's the winter time and you are opening that jar and you're cooking a meal and you're enjoying every moment of making that meal because it takes you back to the summertime and what that harvest was like. And it takes you back to all of those beautiful connections of maybe being in the garden with your family or friends. And so when you're eating that meal of beautiful pasta or a tomato sandwich, it connects you to the lineage of the process, and you're going to delight in that meal in a completely different way. And because we're so connected with textiles at every point of our day, having textiles around oneself that you are inherently in an acknowledged relationship of care with is a way of feeling connected to your neighbors and your people around you, your family. I have patches on several of my clothes that are from my dad's old pajamas. I have other clothes of my husband's that are no longer mendable. And so his garments become part of my patching. And so all of that textile and those memories and that life of living in those garments is attached to those garments. And so when you're handling the textiles, that's present. I have a bath towel I indulged in purchasing that was woven by a weaver in my neighborhood here, and it was far more expensive than buying a towel going into a shop and buying a commercial cotton towel. But I'll have it for much longer, and it also is this moment of joy every time I pick up that towel to use it, because I remember talking to the weaver. I remember that kind of like early days of forming that relationship with another maker and those exchanges that happen. And so when we can give ourselves the space and the time wherever we can to be mending and taking care of the things that we are using in our daily life, they become more imbued with that energy and more imbued with those experiences, and the objects themselves become more elevated in value. And so there's this like positive feedback loop of self-love and self-care and happiness and dopamine hits that kind of keep resonating back. And when we've made the choice to be purchasing the lowest common denominator, cheapest t-shirts, because it's what we can afford and because it's the model that we've been forced into participating in, there's no joy there. There's no, it's just going to maintain that level of, drudgery, I guess, in the kind of care and in dismissive sense of what that object is.
That's so beautiful. I think I expected this sense of therapy in the slower pace to come through,
Yeah.
but I didn't expect that whole connectivity and that feeling of friendship with the clothes. And I listen to that and feel like you've just given a sense of why this fast pace of life is really disconnecting us from being human and losing sense of purpose and meaning in our lives, and how the artistry and the journey that you've taken is demonstrating self-love through clothing. How beautiful is that? And it's what a wonderful answer. Thank you so much. I think that we've kind of touched on these two very extremes of relationship with textiles, and I'd love to ask, before we finish, just is there a middle ground? Is there steps that people can take today without devoting their whole lives to it?
Yes, because not everybody's going to grow their own clothes. That's really absurd, right? I think any step you take is a step towards reclaiming some clothing autonomy. And anything you can be reading and learning and connecting with others is a part of building your textile literacy. And it's, thinking of it from the perspective of literacy, we start with learning our alphabet. So, not being frustrated at not being able to like jump in here, but recognize like, oh, I'm going to start with just learning some simple steps. And then those simple steps will build to the next. And there are so many communities out in the world of individuals with incredible skills that are really excited and passionate to share those skills. So finding your local community of people that you can be developing your skills alongside. I don't do any of this in a vacuum. I'm not doing any of this on my own. There are so many people that are a part of my learning journey and that I am learning from and that I am sharing with. And that sense of community is really key. And at the end of the day, I'm not necessarily teaching other people how to grow their own clothing. There are some that take it to that extent, but as much as anything, it's about educating consumers so that people understand perhaps not why something costs so much when they're looking at price tags of things that have been made by local makers, when they're looking at things that have been made in a sustainable considered fashion, but are maybe asking the question, how can this cost so little? And then starting to consider what are the subsidizations that have happened, what are the injustices on a social and environmental impact that have allowed this cost to come in at this point. So, I think key things are looking to natural materials, natural fibers as much as possible, going to thrift stores and finding, being able to in any way step out of the glut of what is in the majority of stores, look to see who are some local makers that you can financially support if you're in that place, to do so. And looking at where there's like garments in your own closet, instead of like throwing things out and starting fresh, because where do they go when they leave your home? How can you use those garments as your learning process and just experiment and enjoy and be playful about how you can be creating your own aesthetic, your own fashion style. How can you recycle the clothes that are in your own household, the textiles that are in your own home, as a starting point. So I think that becomes a great place to begin. But for sure, find your people. Find the people that can step into that work with you is really vital.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure to hear from you today. I really appreciate your time. And if people want to keep digging in and learning more, is the best place to send them to your website?
Yes, earthhand.com is a fantastic place to find me. I'm mostly on Instagram. So Sharon Kallis on Instagram or EarthHand on Instagram. I'd also encourage people to just do a little search, their search engine on Fibershed with their own local community, and see what comes up as a way of connecting. There's also lots of different maker labs and different organizations that have textile or soft labs for material exploration to find people that you can be learning with and learning from, and connect with community gardens, look at where there can be textile plants that are layered in with food gardens, because they don't need to be separate entities. It works best actually when they're together. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and very best of luck with everything.
Thank you. Thanks.
And thank you for listening to this episode of We Are Carbon. You can find links in the description to explore more from Sharon and some of the other references that she mentioned. And alongside, there's info to help you learn more with We Are Carbon. There are many conversations that we've had now, and a format with animations to help us digest some of the big concepts. I'll highlight a few bits so you can get a feel for all of the formats. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date. And let's keep figuring this all out together.